Let me ask you something direct. Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling like the villain, yet deep down, you know you did nothing wrong? That's not a coincidence. That's the guilt loop they trap you in, a psychological cycle built not on truth, but on emotional manipulation. And the more empathetic you are, the more likely you are to be its prisoner. But today, we're going to dismantle that loop, brick by brick. I once worked with a woman named Claire. Brilliant, compassionate, the kind of person who remembered birthdays no one else did. She came into therapy thinking she was the problem, always apologizing, always anxious, always exhausted. Why? Because every time she said no to her partner, even politely, he made her feel like she just committed emotional murder. He never shouted, no threats, just a quiet, disappointed face, a long silence, and then the words, "I thought I could count on you." She'd cave. Every time. Not because she was weak, but because she was good. And he knew exactly how to twist that goodness into a weapon. That's how guilt loops work. They don't need chains. They just need access to your conscience. In this video, I'll show you how these loops are built, why you keep falling for them, and how to break free without becoming cold, bitter, or selfish. Because the goal isn't to stop feeling. The goal is to stop being controlled. It always begins quietly, not with blame, not with shouting. Just a small sigh, a disappointed glance, a subtle shift in tone that makes you wonder, did I do something wrong? That's the first brick. Emotional manipulators rarely start with control. They start with intimacy. They study you, not with admiration, but with intention. They look for empathy. They look for your instinct to protect, to repair, to please. And once they find it, they begin building. Slowly, carefully. It begins with small favors, then expectations, then guilt layered beneath praise. You're the only one I can count on. That sentence isn't a compliment, it's a setup. Because when you can't show up, when you're tired, busy, or simply not in the mood, they'll remind you of who you used to be for them. What happened to you, they'll ask. Not because they care, but because they want the version of you that says yes, even when it hurts. This is not random. It's a loop, a cycle designed to turn your conscience into a leash. And the tighter it pulls, the more you mistake it for your own voice. Carl Jung understood this long before modern psychology gave it a label. He said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. And one of the most effective ways to avoid oneself is to make you carry the shame that belongs to them. But ask yourself this, if guilt was truly a sign of morality, why does it show up most in the people being manipulated? Because in a guilt loop, guilt isn't a compass, it's a cage. And the more you question yourself, the less you'll question them. And this is where most people get stuck. They think the pain is a sign of love. That being drained is the price of being kind. But kindness without boundaries isn't virtue. It's vulnerability wrapped in silence. The worst part is the more reflective you are, the deeper it cuts. You replay every word. You overanalyze every reaction. And in trying not to hurt anyone, you end up hurting yourself quietly, consistently, and in the name of goodness. But that's only the surface. If you're finding value in this, consider subscribing. The next part will go deeper into the philosophical roots behind why we mistake guilt for empathy and how it's turned into a weapon. Most people assume that guilt comes from doing something wrong. But in many cases, guilt comes from doing something different, something that violates not your morals, but someone else's expectations. And the more empathetic you are, the more likely you are to internalize those expectations as if they were your own. That's when empathy stops being a virtue. That's when it becomes a weapon. Friedrich Nietzsche once said, "He who despises himself still respects himself as one who despises." It sounds paradoxical, but it reveals something brutal about how we absorb guilt. When you're trapped in the guilt loop, you begin to self-attack, thinking that if you punish yourself enough, you'll somehow regain your worth. You mistake self-criticism for growth. You call it humility, but it's just psychological surrender. Manipulators love this. They rely on people who are introspective, ethical, emotionally intelligent, because these are the ones who will turn on themselves before ever pointing a finger outward. You begin to uphold a warped version of moral duty, where your pain becomes your penance and your silence becomes your service. Jean-Paul Sartre called it bad faith, the denial of one's own freedom for the sake of pleasing others. And in this distorted form of empathy, your very ability to feel becomes a leash tied to someone else's approval. Let's be clear, you didn't sign up to be their caretaker. But somewhere along the line, you were taught that your value is measured by how well you absorb discomfort, especially the discomfort of those who refuse to process their own emotions. So you play the role, the fixer, the forgiver, the one who understands, until one day you wake up emotionally bankrupt, exhausted, not from giving too much, but from giving for the wrong reasons. That's not morality. That's martyrdom disguised as love. The difference is subtle, but devastating. Because while morality is a compass that leads you toward integrity, guilt in the hands of a manipulator is a GPS that reroutes your life toward submission. It tells you that unless you carry someone else's emotional burden, you're selfish. That unless you comply, you're cruel. That unless you betray yourself, you're betraying them. And maybe that's what you've been avoiding all this time. You weren't raised to set boundaries. You were raised to sacrifice. You weren't taught how to say no with grace. You were taught that saying no is rejection, that holding space for yourself is abandonment of others, that choosing peace is a form of betrayal. But it isn't. You don't owe your empathy to people who weaponize it. You don't owe kindness to people who twist it. You don't owe emotional labor to people who refuse to do their own. And here's what no one tells you. Sometimes, the most moral act you can commit is to walk away. You recognized the pattern. You saw the loop. You even whispered to yourself, "This isn't right." So why didn't you leave? Why do so many people, even after they become aware of emotional manipulation, continue to stay in the game? The answer isn't weakness. It's programming. Somewhere in your past, perhaps as early as childhood, you learned that love is something you must earn. That safety is conditional. That peace only comes when others are happy, even if it costs you your sanity. And that belief didn't vanish with time. It matured. It evolved. It disguised itself as kindness, as compassion, as emotional intelligence. But at its core, it's still fear. Fear of abandonment. Fear of rejection. Fear of being labeled as the selfish one. Carl Jung called this the shadow, the hidden parts of ourselves we try to suppress, deny, or project. And here's the paradox. The more you strive to be good, the more you disown the parts of you that are capable of saying no, setting limits, or choosing yourself. You begin to see your strength as cruelty, your anger as immaturity, your detachment as betrayal. So you bend again and again because guilt feels more familiar than freedom. You see, when someone plays the guilt card on you, it doesn't just trigger emotion, it triggers identity. You don't hear, "You're not helping me." You hear, "You're not good enough." That's why you over-explain. That's why you justify. That's why you stay long after you know you shouldn't. And in trying to avoid hurting others, you become the one quietly bleeding. Viktor Frankl, a man who survived the unimaginable, once said, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. And sometimes, what needs to change isn't your empathy, but the illusion that you owe it to everyone." Because here's the brutal truth: no one can keep you in the guilt loop unless a part of you believes you belong there. And that belief, that you are responsible for someone else's discomfort, that your worth is measured by how much you tolerate, that love means surrender, that belief is the real prison. So ask yourself, how many apologies have you whispered just to keep the peace? How many compromises have you made that no one even noticed? How many times have you called it love when it was really self-abandonment? And maybe that's why you keep playing their game. Because you've mistaken self-erasure for strength, compliance for compassion, and suffering for virtue. But that's not who you are. And what comes next is worse, because when guilt turns into identity, it begins to dictate your reality. This is where the trap tightens. Because guilt feels like responsibility, but they are not the same. Guilt says, "I'm bad." Responsibility says, "I made a choice." Guilt paralyzes. Responsibility empowers. But when you've been conditioned to prioritize other people's emotional states over your own truth, you begin to merge the two. You start believing that feeling bad means you did something wrong. That's the illusion. That's the core manipulation. You say no to something you can't commit to, and suddenly, you're losing sleep over it. Not because the decision was unethical, but because someone felt hurt by your boundary. And now, their feelings have become your burden. Again, Arthur Schopenhauer once said, "Compassion is the basis of morality, but compassion is not compliance." Compassion doesn't mean sacrificing your identity to soothe someone else's dysfunction. The difference is sharp, and essential guilt is about control. Responsibility is about choice. Guilt comes with shame and self-punishment. Responsibility comes with clarity and correction. But here's the catch. When you've spent your life being rewarded for being the peacemaker, the caretaker, the emotional sponge, you begin to associate guilt with goodness. You start confusing your inability to tolerate someone else's discomfort with your own moral compass. That confusion doesn't just make you vulnerable, it makes you predictable. Manipulators know this. That's why they never ask you to fix things directly. They let the guilt do the asking for them. And the moment you feel it, you come running, apologizing, accommodating, contorting, even when you know better, because guilt whispers, you're responsible for how they feel. But responsibility whispers back, you're responsible for how you respond. And that's the shift. It's not your job to keep everyone happy. It's not your role to absorb unspoken needs. It's not your duty to anticipate the emotional weather of everyone around you just to avoid the storm. Responsibility is rooted in action. You broke something, own it. You hurt someone with intention, apologize. You ignored your values, realign. But guilt without clarity is just noise, a fog that clouds your judgment and keeps you spinning in circles. So what's the lesson? Stop apologizing for things you didn't do. Stop rescuing people from the consequences of their own emotional immaturity. Stop calling yourself responsible when you were simply afraid to disappoint. And most importantly, stop mistaking guilt for growth. Because the truth is, growth doesn't always feel good. Sometimes it feels like betrayal. Sometimes it feels like loneliness. Sometimes it feels like guilt. But that doesn't mean it's wrong. And if you've come this far, maybe you're finally starting to understand. It was never about guilt. It was about power. And now, for the first time, you're about to take yours back. It doesn't happen with a single conversation. It doesn't come with revenge confrontation or a perfectly worded boundary. The break doesn't crack like thunder. It snaps like a whisper, quiet but final. It starts with this awareness: you were never broken. You were conditioned. You were conditioned to believe that being kind meant being quiet, that being loving meant being available, that being moral meant being endlessly self-sacrificing. But morality without self-respect is martyrdom. And kindness without boundaries is submission. To escape the guilt loop, you must first recognize it for what it is: not a flaw in you, but a system built around you. A system that rewards self-erasure and punishes emotional independence. A system where peace is earned through obedience and guilt is used to maintain control. And here's where it gets deeper. You don't just walk away from the guilt loop. You disengage from the role it cast you in. You stop performing. You stop apologizing for your truth. You stop attending the emotional theater where your worth is measured by how well you contort. That doesn't make you heartless. It makes you sovereign. Nietzsche called this the path beyond good and evil, not in the sense of abandoning ethics, but in outgrowing the simplistic binary that says, if you make someone uncomfortable, you must be wrong. That's not moral clarity. That's manipulation disguised as virtue. Real clarity begins with questions that cut through the fog. Am I truly responsible for this feeling? Is this guilt rooted in my values or in their expectations? If I didn't feel guilty, would I still believe I did something wrong? You break the loop by choosing discomfort over dishonesty, by letting people be disappointed, by enduring the false accusations without rushing to prove your worth. Because when someone uses guilt to control you, your refusal to be controlled will always be framed as cruelty. Let them call it that. You are not responsible for how people interpret your boundaries. You are only responsible for honoring them. You don't need to fight. You don't need to explain. You simply need to stand still in your truth, in your calm, in your refusal to collapse. Because the moment you stop reacting, the loop ends. And what happens after? You reclaim something priceless. Not just your time, not just your energy, but your dignity. Because the most powerful thing you can say in the face of manipulation isn't "I'm sorry." It's "I see it now." And once you see it, you can never unsee it. That's when the healing begins. And if this video helped you see it too, consider subscribing. Because the next time they try to make you feel small, you'll be ready. You were never too much. You were just surrounded by people who benefited when you made yourself less. If you take one thing from this video, let it be this: guilt is not a sign of moral failure. It's often the scar tissue left by people who couldn't carry their own emotional weight, so they handed it to you. But now you see it. And once you see the loop, you have a choice. You can keep apologizing for your existence, or you can reclaim it. So I'll leave you with this. You don't become cruel when you stop being controlled. You become clear. If this message hits something real inside, you don't scroll away quietly. Comment your thoughts. share this with someone still trapped in the loop. And if you want more content like this, hit subscribe because you deserve to hear the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, especially then.